Thank you, Pale Fire. So glad to be back here in our home space at Pale Fire. It's been an exciting season where we've gone off to other listing areas. And I really, for those who are watching on YouTube in those areas, thank you for welcoming us in new places. It's been an exciting thing. I never knew that I would go on the road with Books and Brews. So what excitement. Really excited tonight to introduce Karen. And as Matt said, starting off the new year, 2024, feels really good to be talking about your book. Karen Wright Marsh is an author, speaker, and the executive director and co-founder of Theological Horizons, which is a ministry that supports Christians and seekers in academia by providing a welcoming community for engaging faith, thought, and life. I think that sums up a lot of things in welcoming. She's also the host of the Vintage Saints and Sinners podcast, which was her first book. We don't have it here tonight because there was a little error with the publisher, but we have it available and we can order it for folks. She holds a degree in philosophy from Wheaton College and linguistics from the University of Virginia. Wahoo wah. Came over the mountain in this lovely weather, dared to cross Afton. And she lives with Charles Marsh. Many of you may recognize him, a UVA professor and a past Books and Brews author at the Bonhoeffer House in Charlottesville. So she's here tonight to talk about her latest book, Wake Up to Wonder, 22 Invitations to Amazement in the Everyday. Let's give Karen a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I am delighted to be with you on this. Such a rainy night. I was like, y'all are here. I was amazed. You're so intrepid. And I'm a listener of WMRA and I am a supporter. So y'all do the same. So I'm honored to be with you. Yay.
Yeah. And she's already a fan of Pale Fire beer.
Oh, yes.
Tried that out.
Yeah. I sampled it. Just, so I could say how good it was.
That's right. Well, as Matt said, and when we were looking at this book and we thought 2024, this is perfect because people will be making New Year's resolutions. It's only January 9th. You're not beating yourself up yet.
We got this. It's easy.
We got this. And so how perfect to be looking at the year in a new way, and that seems to be a very important part of your book is looking at things in a different way. But really, why did you choose wonder in the times we're living in? Why is wonder and amazement things that we should be looking for?
Well, the book came out in July and I did a book event actually at New Dominion Books in Charlottesville. And the first question was, how can you talk about wonder at a time of violence, of a time of, climate catastrophe? It was a very hot summer. This is even before the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it was a great question. And so, if wonder is kind of a blissed out, checking out, it's appealing, but it feels so irresponsible in a way. So I thought that was a really wonderful question. And it gave me some time to think about it. And I thought about one of the characters in this book, Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, who was a philosopher and theologian and a pastor and advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King and other leaders in the civil rights movement. So he was on the front lines, with people who knew a thing or two about strife and conflict and racism and all the evils, the ills that beset us even now. And Dr. Thurman emphasized pause and rest and wonder. One of his quotes is something along the lines of, we must address the little anxieties that beset us before we can address the big anxieties that surround us. And he would tell all these people who were, marching for civil rights in Mississippi and Alabama to cultivate the art of creative lassitude, which I think is so wonderful and poetic.
Explain that.
Creative lassitude, but to rest, to pause, and that it's a matter of survival. If you don't rest, if you don't embrace wonder, if you don't find amazement, you will perish. And that's what he says: rest, lest we perish. So he has given me a little more confidence, I think, in talking about this idea of wonder and amazement.
Yeah. And he is one of the characters or the people you pull upon. You describe yourself as, I love this. I know, this is such a collector of stories and a curator of Christian traditions. How, with all of these fantastic, there's 22 from Wangara Maathai, which I don't know if I said her name right.
Well, actually, Martin could tell us because she's Kenyan. So one of your colleagues will have to check in with that.
Yeah.
But she's a Kenyan woman who planted trees. She started the Greenbelt movement. So
Henry Nouwen to Augustine, to these ancients. How did you curate and choose these specific people to sort of guide us to wonder?
Well, some of the background through my work with Theological Horizons, I'm with college students a lot. And, if you have a college student in your life, they're in a dynamic time of change and decision and, sort of disequilibrium, which makes them delightful. But some of the students I know, they've grown up in church and they know all about liturgy. Many of them are spiritual practices and disciplines, but they're just not. They're not good. They're not clear. They're not comfortable with the dogma, with a lot of sort of the things that they've seen in their church experience, many of them. Others are like very steady and grounded. Others have no faith background and literally describe themselves as, spiritual, but not religious. And so when I have a group of 20, 30, 40 students in a room, they don't all share the same sort of beliefs or intellectual frameworks. And because I don't know who's in the room, which just makes it really wonderful, I start telling stories and I'll say, my goal here is, not to make you believe something. I'm not, putting this on you, but I would just love to introduce you to these brothers and sisters who lived in other chaotic times, in other violent times. This is a hard time now, but they're 18, 19. They think it's the worst time that ever was. So it's like, well, Julian of Norwich lived in England and the plague came through 3 times in her lifetime and half of the people died. So just to kind of put it in like, well, these people lived real lives in the real world and somehow they live spiritual lives. So they teach me practices too. They not only have beliefs and words, but they have enacted, embodied faith, which I love. And that's what we all want, I think, is, for me, a faith that I can live with and live out. And so part of my collecting has been to go beyond praying. Prayer is included here, or Bible reading, but to think about other practices that make us whole, practices that wellness practitioners teach us about, or, that we know, walking, breathing, eating. So I've just had a lot of fun linking these practices that I'm curious about to some of the saints. And I call them saints. Sorry, you Catholic brothers and sisters, I'm real generous with who gets to be called a saint. It's like, I just call them a saint. I just say, they followed Christ in their own lives. That's kind of my definition. So no, I have a very low bar, so forgive me. But like Martin Luther, he was the big reformer. He loved music. He loved to sing. And I'm in the Oratorio Society. We were talking about that. So I thought, well, let's find out what Martin says about music and singing. And I just sort of went down this rabbit hole and learned a whole lot about his teaching on singing and music. So it's sort of been like the stuff I love to do and the things that I want to learn more about.
That explains, because I would read and I knew something of this person, but not this piece of it. And it was so much fun to read your book because it opened up a whole new aspect of that person that you had only known in one way. So did the practice, did that come first that you were thinking? I know this is
a great question.
It's a chicken and the egg thing.
Yeah.
Did the guide or did the practice or did they come together?
I think it was kind of a back and forth. So I wrote this first book, Vintage Saints and Sinners. I profiled 25 different people. And I tell these stories again and again with students. And so I've started linking them with the practices. Part of it was I was listing sort of practices, spiritual and wellness and personal practices that I think are wonderful and interesting, like I said. Even rest, Even reading the news is one of the practices in my book. So in some cases, I sort of had to go looking for somebody who matched up. And then sometimes a saint that I love or a spiritual exemplar that I love, like Hildegard von Bingen. I was talking to your mother. We love Hildegard. Like she has so much to say about nutrition and about eating and about health. So she just brought me that practice. So there was a lot of sketching and back and forth. And I also really wanted to have a really interesting representation of different people from different times and different sort of identities and backgrounds and experiences. So there was a lot of back and forth.
And not all of these people are people that we've heard of before, right? You chose, I love how you say that the unremarkable story, we need to hear that too.
Yeah.
And they were remarkable as well.
Yeah. I think it's so easy to say, those white male saints from Europe, and God bless them, they lived faithful lives. But I want to tell you about Pandita Ramabai from India that I learned about from my grandmother. She was a Hindu woman who was a scholar of Sanskrit as a young girl, and her father taught her to read and taught her the scriptures. And they were kicked out of their village because girls were not supposed to be handling words and these scriptures. And she grew up, going through the jungles with her family, reciting their Sanskrit scriptures as pilgrims and for food. And her father and mother died of starvation. And later she was married, she became a widow. And if you know anything about the Brahmin tradition, to be a widow is basically a death sentence. You're cast out as a cursed person. And in that context, she began reading the Gospel of John from the Bible, and she just happened to come upon it and just became curious about this Jesus person who would talk to the Samaritan woman, with respect and love. She's like, this religion is kind of new. And she was intrigued by that. So for her story, the practice to me is scripture. What are the stories that we find in the Bible that can liberate us and invite us into a life of vitality? So I was like, oh, she's an interesting one. I had not heard of her, but she's on a stamp in India. So she's bona fide. And she's known as the first feminist in India because she created communities for girls and women, for these widows. And she took them in and she taught them skills and educated them. So she's worthy of a really good story, I think. And
I have to ask, just because the number 22 is such an interesting number, and I kept thinking, who was cut? Who just?
Well, actually, that was you talked to an editor, and she's like, well, 25, you already did that in the first book. And then 20s have an even number. So odd numbers are good. So I don't know why. We were like 21. Okay, fine. I'll give you 21. But then this Wangari Maathai, she was added on because I was like, we need to talk about earth care, creation care. So I was like in the process, and I went back to the publisher. I'm like, please, can we make it 22? So, but I don't know, totally random, but we can do more. I can tell you more if you want more.
I thought there might be like
nothing. There's no secret, sacred.
No biblical reason.
No biblical. No,
I don't think
21.
That, but I just
22. If 22 means something to you, please tell me, and I'll start explaining it that way.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of that. And you say it in your intro a little bit about how these figures, how these saints can somewhat disarm that stigma or that thing we think of today, and what your students were saying of that capital word religion, what we've put on it of that feeling of being, judgmental activities and dogma. How do these characters kind of liven how we look at our world?
Yeah. Well, I think, yes, religion is so problematic, and yet in Christian religion, I'll just speak for the American church. I mean, we can go back. There are plenty of stories we can see through the history of Christianity. But someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who, left the cotton fields in Mississippi as a sharecropper and went down and tried to register to vote. And she said, I put my hand up as high as I could get it. And when she returned home that day to the plantation, she had been fired and kicked out of her house and, removed from her family. And she suffered for the movement for civil rights. And, you should read her story because she ends up in Washington, speaking to on TV about, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. But she was a person of faith. She loved Jesus. She loved to sing. She loved the white volunteers in Mississippi in 1964. She was like this example of joy and love and courage. So when I tell her story and I think about her story, I'm like, that's the kind of religion that, that's the kind of woman I want to follow. And Howard Thurman too. There's so much wisdom in when you see people who live lives of real courage and real integrity or real humility. It doesn't have to be grand. To me, that's like so much better than just trying to defend or explain all the horrible things that, have been done in the name of God, because that's all there. So let's not brush that aside, but let's remember that other people have lived and died for this person of Jesus Christ and for spirituality. I think it helps me appreciate, exemplars of other faiths too, because there's so many similarities and so many beautiful sort of resonances that we find. Yeah.
It really, I think sometimes just approaching that and seeing it lived in a different way and let's talk a little bit about the format of your book.
Sure.
Just the way that you allow us to read about it, this person, hear their story, and then you give a little bit and then trying something. So talk a little bit about how you did that and also sort of how you segmented the book into 4 areas.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a great question. So I divided the chapters into 4 sections. I have to look back. Wake up, reach out, go deep, and dwell. And this has some background because I've been doing a lot of research about mind health and physical health and sort of happiness and meaning. So these are categories that I've sort of pieced together from some of my research. So these pillars of wellness and of a good life. So that was that's a little bit of the backstory. But I grew up in a Christian tradition where there was a lot of talk about spiritual disciplines, which fasting, prayer, like hard things that are good for you and are going to be, and usually you have to do them really early in the morning. That's the more spiritual time. And I mean, no shade on any of that, but it's hard. And I work with a lot of students and I think it's so easy for them to be overwhelmed and just defeated and disappointed and discouraged and we all have intentions right now, all of our New Year's resolutions. So I decided we're just going to have a little more fun with this and just like make it light and easier to like sort of dip your toe in. So I call these not disciplines, but invitations. So every chapter, every section has a part called try this. And we're going to try something up from this, but it's like just today, if you're interested in walking, try this. If you're interested in Lilias Trotter, who was a painter, and you want to see beauty in the world, just try this. So I have these little sort of do it yourself reflections, journalings, exercises, and they're seriously, seriously easy because what I'm trying to do is just help us wake up every day. You try it, you flip through it, you've got 5 minutes because you have to start small. And sometimes those 2-minute intervals are they're just good, And the bigger disciplines like that, those are projects for life, and those are good too. But in the meantime, just try this.
Yeah. Well, I felt it was very kind. Yours was considered, New Year's resolutions and things. It was an invitation. Mm-hmm. You even gave permission to the reader to skip those parts or set it down for a little bit, come back to it. Mm-hmm. That was a lovely gift.
Well, that's how I want to be treated. So, and seriously, with young adults, you're just like, oh, honey, just go take a nap, and then come back.
One of them
we all
that.
Just like, you're fine. We're going to be just like, it's fine. So yeah, we just all need a lot of gentleness and encouragement.
Was there, I know when I read one of the pieces, it kind of had a throwback. It was Lilius Trotter
Yeah.
and the painting and the drawing and seeing more by doing that. I kept thinking of my elementary grade arts teacher who gave me a C, and the failure. I just wondered if any of these were harder for you, any of these practices.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely the visual arts. I'm not again, that's a little flashback, because I was the kid who could sing, but I couldn't draw. So this has been a growing experience for me too. Yeah. Yeah. But, we're trying not to judge. We're trying to be more gracious with ourselves. So, yeah.
Is there an advantage, you think, to having more wonder at doing things that might be
definitely
not a natural space?
Well, and I think your mother and I were talking, we were talking about wonder. Oh, it was Eli. We were talking about this idea of wonder, because part of the thing that's really gotten me excited about these little practices, these invitations, is the more I read about amazement and wonder, the more I learn that this is good for us. Like, we are literally built physically, mentally, spiritually to experience amazement. And there's a guy named Dr. Keltner. He's a scientist at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's written a book called Awe, the New Science of Amazement or something, right? There's an interview with him with Krista Tippett. So if you want the short version, listen to that. He is not a religious person, but he talks, the whole science is what happens in your body when you experience something vast, something amazing, something bigger than yourself. Like when you have chills in your body, like that's like he goes into the evolution of why we have chills or why we tear up. The experience of what he calls collective effervescence, which comes from Durkheim. But it's like when you get to, like when Alabama beat Georgia. I mean, that was amazing, right? Like, or you dance together or you celebrate. So all these experiences of wonder and amazement, our bodies want it. Like, it helps our mental sort of perspective. If you're, we all know you've been out in nature and you've looked at this incredible mountain, or you look at the starry sky and you just have this new sense of like your place in the world, and being small is kind of, he talks about like what a relief it is to sort of put yourself in perspective with the rest of the world. So like, I'm just looking for ways every day to kind of capture a little bit of that amazement and awe and playfulness, because I know it's good for me. And now I'm on a total kick. So the Washington Post did a paper article on birdsong, and they have there's a clip online, like 6 minutes of birds chirping. And they said, if you go outside and you listen to birds chirp, like all the stuff good things it does for your blood pressure and kind of helps with depression. So I was like, okay. Or, forest bathing, all these things are just everywhere. Or cooking, I'm sure brewing beer is a good practice for you. So I don't know. I'm just more and more and more seeing like there's so many opportunities to be well, whether this is part of a Christian practice for you or just your human experience. This is just something to pursue.
Well, we're going to try something fun and different here at Books and Brews in Pale Fire, and we're going to do a try this. So you all are going to get to experience, having not read, some of you may have read the book, but she's going to walk us through a try this here at the brewery. We'll see how we can do it.
Yeah. Don't be afraid. First of all, you will not have to share with your neighbor, and you will not have to dance, although we could dance later if you'd like. I am all for dancing.
You're going to have them sing, right?
Oh yeah, definitely singing with the mic. It's karaoke night. Surprise. No, I hate small group things. But I make people do it, but I don't have to do it. Anyway, we're not going to do that. What I'm going to get to is just a little reflection time. So you can just relax. It could be fun. We'll see. Well, this intention, because it's New Year's, and I know you have resolutions, or if you're like me, you don't. But this comes from, and that's good. I'm with you on that. This intention comes from is rooted in the story of Brother Lawrence. He was born in 1614 in France. He was a disabled, barely literate peasant who had fought in a little militia for pocket money and food and was injured. He so he couldn't fight anymore. He tried to be a butler, but he was real clumsy and he kept dropping things. So he got fired and finally ended up at a convent, at a monastery in Paris, because he had nowhere else to go. And the monastery let him in, but he had no education. So he couldn't be a monk. He could not be a priest. He could barely read. So they sent him down to the kitchen to work. And that was like his only option. And he did say he hated kitchen work. So he's sort of kind of one of my favorite people. But so he labored in the kitchen. He would go upstairs for the mass and the services and the words, and he just could never understand it. He couldn't master. He felt like a total failure. So one day, or over time, he resolved to have a new way of sort of being spiritual in the monastery, and that was to remain aware of God's presence. So in his little book, The Practice of the Presence of God, which he dictated to someone, he said, I just resolved myself to become aware of God's presence. And so he said that he wanted to pick up a straw from the ground for love of God, seeking him only and nothing else. So year after year, he was just in the kitchen, running errands, scrubbing these horrible pots. And this is a 17th century kitchen. It's hot down there. He just developed over time this mindfulness practice. So for students that I know, including one of my kids, he goes, I think I'm a Buddhist because I want to be a contemplative. I'm like, we've got Brother Lawrence who can teach you something about contemplation. So he just developed this awareness of God's presence. And one of the great quotes from he says, one is not a saint all of a sudden, which is so true. But people would come to him and ask him for advice, fancy court women and educated people, because he just had this reputation of being joyful and mindful, and he just had this special something. And so he would recommend that each person offer a brief little remembrance of God. And he would say, God is everywhere. We can speak to him wherever we are. Our hearts can speak to him in 1,000 different ways. All we need is a little love, and then living this way will not be difficult. So over time, he became a kind of a spiritual genius with this little practice of the presence of God. So what I'm going to do is read a few of his, just a sentence or two from him, give you like 2 or 3 sort of guided questions for you to just relax and kind of let your mind wander. Does that sound good? And we will not share at the end, like I said. So, all right. So like you're all looking pretty comfortable, but if you want to be more comfortable, just get more comfortable. You can close your eyes. You can lower your gaze. That's what the yoga teachers say. Soften your gaze. And just listen. We're going to take, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and try this. Brother Lawrence says, we must not grow weary of doing little things for the love of God, who looks not on the great size of the work, but on the love of it. We must not grow weary of doing little things for the love of God, who looks not on the great size of the work, but on the love of it. So here is the invitation. First, think of someone whom you love, or who you would like to love more, and bring them to mind. As you envision this person whom you love, might you think now of one thing you can do in the coming 24 hours for the sake of that person or for the sake of God. Put aside grand resolutions for now. Settle on a small, practical action that expresses your care. Think of one small thing. As you consider this intention and this person whom you love, Now make a concrete plan to act on your intention. Think about how you might actually do this thing in the next day and imagine yourself doing it. So in the next day, remember Brother Lawrence cheering you on as he says, we must not grow weary of doing little things for the love of God, who looks not on the great size of the work, but on the love of it.
Thank you. I don't think we've done something like that at Books and Brews before.
It's so easy. See, you just close your eyes.
Rest is a good thing.
Yes.
I'd like to open it up for questions. That is part of our conversation here, is that you're a part of that. If there's some questions out there, now that you've focused your act and intention. The question is, what would all of these different saints or teachers, what would the one thing that they would have in common be?
If I get one word right now. Afraid. Okay, good. That gives me a little more to work with. I was thinking of discovery, curiosity, energy, courage.
You had some that you talked about how varied the paths for some of these folks were to that discovery, and some blundered into it, you said.
Yes.
And I love that. I have a thing about blundering. So I wondered who rises to the top in blundering.
And blunderers? Oh, so many. Well, one thing I love about these, what I always love to do with these stories is to try to look at their story when they were 18, 19, 20, this sort of college age. That's always sort of interesting to see, and see how their lives change. I think of the Caedmon. And his practice, or the invitation that I bring from him, is gratitude. So Caedmon, let me turn this page 62. I won't go too deeply into it, but he lived in England. He was born in around 657, so real long time. And he was like a sheep herder, he kept the cattle at the monastery, and it was like medieval times, and they would all have these, dinners, and at the end of the meal everyone would go around and sing, and they would pass the harp around, and each person would have to sing ballads and stuff. I mean, some of you are sort of better scholars than I am, but basically the tradition was you had to entertain each other after dinner, and he was a terrible singer, and he just was a blunderer all the time. He was terrible. So he told the story about how he would just, like, when they would start after dinner singing the songs, he would slip out and get back to the barn and just like sleep with the cows, and like just to be alone, because he was always just so humiliated by this demand to entertain. But he was there, and he had a dream in the night of God calling him to sing and to tell the story of creation, and to tell the story of God's glory. And he woke up in the morning, and, he realized he had this dream, and he told, his superintendent, who took him to the abbess, and because it was a miracle that he had, and he, all of a sudden, he could sing this song, and he was like, all of a sudden, miraculously, a poet. And they tested him and all kinds of things about, of course, to be sure if he was, it was the real deal. And he was. And so he learned the stories of the Bible, the sacred stories of the Christian tradition, and became like one of the earliest, he may be the earliest poet in English, or Old English. So I just love that, even though he hid with the cows, even dreams, came to him. And in spite of himself, he gave praise, he gave thanks, he expressed gratitude to God. And in spite of himself, for sure. Yeah.
It's good stories. Blunderers. Another saint that I think we should talk about, because it's appropriate here with NPR and WMRA, is Hans and Sophie Scholl.
Scholl.
Mm-hmm. I don't know are many of you familiar with that name?
Yeah. Oh, you know them? Yeah.
And tell us a little of their story.
Well, I'll tell you first, their practice is reading the news. Yes. And Karl Barth, the great, yes, thank you. So that's why she said that thing about NPR. I love this quote, first of all, from Karl Barth, the great Swiss theologian. He says, take your Bible and take your newspaper and read both, but interpret newspapers from your Bible, which I just think is sort of an interesting, difficult thing to do. But Hans and Sophie Scholl were born in Germany, in southern Germany, in 1918, and they died in 1942. They were 2 of 5 children living in this little town in Bavaria, and their father was a Christian. They were Christian people, and their father would always say the verse from James, like, "Be not only hearers of the word, but doers only," and would always sort of encourage them to live their faith. Well, Sophie and Hans, brother and sister, were 12 and 14 years old when Hitler came to power. And so, this challenged, of course, their whole world. And there's a lot to the story, but they ended up at the University of Munich together as students. And they had just a band of other friends, just about 7 other people and 1 professor who secretly and subversively opposed Hitler and the Third Reich. But of course, this was very dangerous. And the University of Munich was a terrible, terrible place. It was like sort of the epicenter of National Socialism. But they started writing on walls at night, and they called themselves the White Rose. This was a secret, sort of little secret activist group. And, in great college student style, they made a big noise with like very little. So they would paint on walls at night, like "Down with Hitler" and "Stop the War Machine." And they put together little leaflets that they would distribute all around town secretly. And they, even a printing machine was illegal. But at great risk to themselves, they did these actions of resistance, in spite of the fact that, it seemed like everybody around them believed the Nazi propaganda. And, the Nazis would put the newspapers behind glass so everybody would read them. And, they had fake news all around them. And yet somehow they saw the truth. And part of it was because they were part of the society, and the guys had to fight. They were as medics on the front lines, but they had this as young people, the discernment to read the news, know what was false, have the courage to say what was true, and challenge their sources. And they were caught and they were executed. Like within days. And we have the transcript of the trials. And Sophie Scholl, this girl, 21, 22 years old, the Gestapo judge is like screaming. And she was standing there, and she said, "We all know this is false, but someone had to say something, and someone had to do something." And I mean, I'm in awe of her. There's a film about her, the German film called Sophie Scholl, The Last Days. But so part of the practice for me is like, where do I get my news? NPR. But how do I discern what's true and what's false? When we talk about this a lot. But I mean, I think their story is really challenging to me, because they talk about the Nazi machine was like a wall, like a brick wall. And their goal was to knock a chip out of the wall. That was all they thought they could do. But they thought if they did that, the whole thing eventually would come down. So the challenge to me is like, do I even try, to knock a chip out of the wall? And they humble me and challenge me a lot. So it's a difficult thing.
Yeah, that was one that I thought it kind of led to another one that you had, which was Fannie Lou
Hamer.
Mm-hmm. Right. And raising your voice. And when do you know when it's the time to raise your voice and raise your hand and stand up for something or call out something that is blatantly not good?
Yeah. So Fannie Lou Hamer, born, in Mississippi, one of the heroines of 1964 in Mississippi. The invitations for me were kind of challenging there, because what does it mean to raise your voice in a time like this? So some of the ideas I had were like, find an artist who is, telling the truth or raising their voice or, putting out a message that you support, and give them money or, help follow them on social media, like encourage voices around you. If you can't do it yourself, write letters, make phone calls. I mean, all the things that we know to do. Like for me, I think that the new way of thinking for me is that these are also spiritual practices. Like, this is not my politics, my conviction, my religion, my devotion, my wellness. Like, to raise my voice is to be whole. And so that, it's a challenging thing, I think, to think about what that might look like. But I think we can be creative. We really can. And again, like doing the little thing with great love always helps me, because we all know these small things make a difference. Even if we're not if we don't have the mic, we can make a difference. So let's do that.
Yeah. Good. Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa.
Where was she?
Oh, she's in the first book, Mother Teresa. Yeah, you have to read that one. She's great. She's a lot, but I love her.
So how has the response been on this book? Came out in the summertime. How have your readers responded? Has anybody sent you, because you say at the end, I love this, to reach out to you if they try Hildegard's joy cookies?
Yeah. Okay, guys. So there's a recipe in here, and I've tried it. Of course, it's in my book. You're supposed to test your recipes, right, before you put them in. Yeah. I put my email address in here because Hildegard von Bingen, I told you she talks a lot about nutrition. And so there are some recipes, and they used to make these cookies called cookies of joy, because she believed that things like ginger and warming spices could literally cure melancholy in you. She was all into, what the different elements do. So I put this recipe. It has more sugar than the 11th century version of cookies. But some people have made them and eaten them. But I would love to hear from you, for sure. And I'm on Instagram now. I'm trying to do better with that. But a lot of this stuff, I'm leading retreats and small groups and having sort of practicing with people. But yeah, it's been good. And I'm running this Theological Horizons. I left some newsletters there and we have a lot of events, a lot of public lectures and things that we're doing. So this book is like just a fun break for me from all that sort of organizational, energy. But it's just fun to share it. It's fun to talk about it. And it's fun to learn other people's practices. And for you, if you find a great article, like the birdsong thing, something else that's good for you, please send it to me. So I think it's been good. I mean, there are a couple, you could review it on Amazon. That always helps, apparently, although we don't like Amazon at all. Buy your books from MK. But I would love to hear from you on this and your best practices, like what gives you wonder and where you find joy, where you find amazement. Because like I said, it's a survival thing. It is. Times like this. Breathing. Yeah.
Who are the saints that are calling the young people, or how they're responding to them?
Yeah, that's, I had never thought of that. Like, who has changed over time? I think my first thought might be in earlier times, and maybe I'm even thinking of my own time, there was a lot of focus on apologetics and intellectual debate and faith and Christian faith as a viable way of thinking about the world. So it was a lot of focus on argument and idea and sort of philosophical debate. So C.S. Lewis was always great. Mere Christianity, has sold, maybe it's one of the best sellers behind the Bible. But I think C.S. Lewis, even now, I think he still resonates, but not for the same reasons. His arguments for why we can believe the Christian story are not so important as I think the fact that he rejected Christianity until he was 33. As a teenager, he said Christianity is for idiots. And, and as a religion, it's not even, or as for a mythology, it's not even the best. So now I'm like, students, like if you got problems, like if you're challenging the traditions of your youth, like this guy like will outdo you. And he had to leave Oxford to go serve in World War I. And he came back and he said, I believe in no God. Even in a foxhole, I never called on him. Like, I'm really like serious about this no God thing. So his journey to faith, and he called himself the most reluctant convert in England, I think is now more compelling, like that personal story of struggle, of not being sure, and of imagination. So his story is coming into this, not through argument, but through the Chronicles of Narnia, like this beautiful story of the mystery of the world and the imagination, and that, because I have this vision and this longing for joy, it means that I was made for another world. There's like a bigger story than me and my mind. So I think that's like a lot of those things have shifted. And so what I'm going to say is I emphasize more the struggle and affirming the questions and like welcoming the curiosity and the discovery, and like just bring what you've got. And also it's a winding turn. So the fact that he felt this way when he was 21 doesn't mean that, and maybe you feel the same way, or however you feel like 10 years from now, like many of us know, you change, you grow, you discover. So kind of telling the saintly stories or the spiritual exemplar stories as growth, discovery, if you're willing to be curious and be brave, to entertain new thoughts, like it's there for you. So does that answer the question? Yeah.
Have you discovered in this storytelling of these remarkable or unremarkable people that the students want to share their stories more?
Well, I do like really intentionally try for that. And I'll say, I say students a lot, but we have a group called Saints of the City, which is very much like the student sort of these readings and stories that I tell, but for grownups with beer and wine. So it's like vintage with wine. And we do the same things in the room. So I just wanted to put that out there. But when we're reading something like Augustine, who's also a great story, like really big party animal in college. So that's always fun to tell how bad he was before he was the great Christian. I'll say to them read his words, and I'll say, well, how did you think about doubt when you were younger or now? Like, what are the messages you get about asking questions or wrestling with faith, let's say? So I'll kind of pull those stories out, and a lot of time, and silence is also fine. So I'll ask a question and say, just think about this for a minute. Or maybe if we're reading a passage, like, is there a word or a phrase that sort of resonates for you, so that they can sort of offer or identify or claim something without like telling the whole story or telling it all or why. But a lot of us, we want to tell our stories. All we need is kind of the right question or the right context. And so it's not hard. And I think that's true. I think it's true for all of us, really, if we feel like there's a space to do that and someone really wants to listen. So thank you. It's fun. Well, one of the characters in this book, the last one, she's close to the end, is Dorothy Day. And she wasn't Mennonite, but I'm sure she had many friends who were Mennonite. And she really talked about these acts of radical mercy, and that the person in front of you, especially the poor person, is literally the body of Christ. This is Christ before you. And so, her acts of kindness, and of course her acts of communal life with Catholic Worker House. She did a lot of things that the Mennonites, which I love the Mennonites. I grew up in Lancaster County with Amish people too. So I'm familiar with that heritage. And I think you're right. Like we talk about these individuals, but the idea of community and, to see community embodied, and always remember, we are part of this community. And I think I love the vision, not only of the people of the community on earth, but, the levels of brothers and sisters who've come before us, like cheering us on and present with us, as we do these small acts together, we need that sense of, I'm not on my own. So yeah, I'll be thinking about that. Thank you.
That's what is so powerful about your book is you're reading about these characters that are experiencing, and they're in all different times and places, but their story is sort of what connects us across time. And those small acts, you speak a lot. I mean, the sections that you break it into of, they're about connection, reaching out and going deep.
Yeah.
So it is about that.
Yeah.
It's lovely. The question being that many of these principles are ecumenical. They talk on humankind, and yet it's kind of based on Christian. Is there room for a book?
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. One of the most amazing, there are many passages that Rabbi Abraham Heschel wrote are about amazement. I don't know if you've ever heard his work. He was very active in the sort of American civil rights movement era, is how I know his work. But he, coming from the Jewish tradition, of course, says to be spiritual is to be amazed. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is wonderful. And he talks about the opposite of faith and belief is not like disbelief, but apathy, of like disregarding the miracle of the world. So he's like a great theologian of amazement and, fully rooted in the Jewish tradition. And Thomas Merton, who's a Christian favorite of mine, was very engaged with, people from the Buddhist tradition, and actually was in Thailand at a conference with Buddhist monks in 1968 and had a long correspondence with them always, and he talks about loving to meet these other practitioners, because he was like, well, how do you do it? He was just so fascinated by their own spiritual lives. And I think even beyond religion, these sort of stated traditions, we see so much of the research and the work around wellness, sort of it all keeps coming around together in these threads. And I think we're just only enriched when we know more about how other humans have lived well in the world. So I am like I said, I'm a great collector. So send me your best others, and I'll start my book. I mean, we can work on it together.
That's always a good spot. Is knowing that
Just
we're launching another one here.
Sure. Okay. You were there when I said that.
That's right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us in this conversation, for enjoying good beer. Next month, we'll be at, falling off the chair. We'll be at Seven Arrows in Waynesboro, and we're talking with Russ Ford and Charles Peppers and Todd Peppers, Crossing the River Styx, the memoir of a death row chaplain. That should be on February 13th. This is what we're going to be talking about. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having
Karen,
me.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you. It's so fun.
She'll be signing books.